Mr. Chief Justice, thank you for joining us at Watchmen on the Wall. We appreciate your time and giving us the opportunity to speak to you and hear your heart on Watchmen on the Wall.
Well, thank you for the invite.
We want to start the interview by going back to 2011, when your nomination was being made known through the media by President Jacob Zuma. It elicited a media storm that many people felt was unwarranted. The first question I want to ask you is, how did that personally make you feel? The accusations that was made against you, and secondly, how did you and your family weather the storm?
Well, the accusations were a bit difficult to handle because they were incorrect. But what made it much easier to deal with them was the experience that I had with the media back in 2009 when I was on the verge of being appointed as a Justice of the Constitutional Court. Because those who were watching the public space then would recall that when the list of 7 out of 22 candidates was made public, comments about me were positive all along. It was only when the list of 4 that was released by the President for consultation with the Chief Justice and those political parties represented in Parliament to comment that I was singled out for very severe criticism. And it revolved around my Christianity. So it had a lot to do with my faith. It looked like there was something about Christianity that did not go down well with people in the media and certain sectors of our society.
Now, from my just coverage of the media at that time, I read a couple of newspapers and sort of monitored the media because we couldn't understand the media storm as well, or the purpose for it. And it did appear to come from a certain group of people that weren't happy with your nomination. Am I correct in saying that?
Well, you're quite correct. In fact, moving from 2009 now to my nomination as Chief Justice, you would also recall that before the actual nomination took place, from the time people started speculating about who could possibly be the Chief Justice of South Africa, my name featured consistently.
Right from the very beginning?
Right from the very beginning. It was never left out. But it got to the point where immediately after the President made his preferred candidate for appointment known, that people in the public domain began to, speak as if I was never considered by them as a possible appointee to the position of Chief Justice. You would recall that some of the comments went like, a surprise or a shock nomination of Mogoeng. But the focus was primarily on my Christian belief. What is his attitude going to be about the gay and lesbian community? The Constitution guarantees their rights. Is he going to be keen to ensure that their constitutional rights are upheld as much as other constitutional rights are given the recognition and the protection that they deserve? Fortunately for me, and it may not make sense to you except you are a Christian, from as far back as 2004, there was a crusade in Mafikeng at the Civic Center. A man by the name Richard Gray came from Pietermaritzburg. He's still alive. I went to see him the other day. He's young. Called me and said, "You are a judge, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "The Lord says you're going to be the Chief Justice of South Africa." 2004 already. I laughed it off. But the more I fasted and prayed, the more I got confirmation of this prophecy from many other men of God, from London, Ghana, Nigeria, Washington, D.C. It really became so real that I had to regularly go on a fast just to retest the veracity and the authenticity of the prophecy. A week before I was actually nominated, one man of God, Apostle Elvis Achambo, sent me an email and said, you know, my wife and I were praying this morning. The Lord says you are about to be elevated. So when the storm came, I had the benefit of the 2009 baptism of fire that went a long way towards helping me develop what is ordinarily or loosely referred to as the thick skin. I had tapped into the extraordinary capacity I never knew I had to withstand the worst of challenges. But more importantly, as the storm gained momentum, from Monday to Wednesday, I would go on a dry fast. I wouldn't take water, I wouldn't take food, 24 hours. Obviously based on the kind of scriptures that you need when you're involved in a spiritual warfare. And that stood me in good stead. Additionally, I think a week or so before the actual interview, God used the same man of God to give a message, and I've got them all in the emails, to say relax and be calm. For a miracle is about to hit you. So I went there restfully in command of the situation. We were enjoying the kind of peace that doesn't make sense, my wife and I, and all my children. So we saw it more as an opportunity to demonstrate that God is very much alive, and if you're faithful and surrendered to Him, and if it is not an ambition that you are pursuing, but a God-given vision that you are pursuing, He will protect you, irrespective of how many millions happen to be opposed to your nomination or appointment based either on their logic or the desire to further self-interest, sectoral interest, or just sheer opposition to the very Christian faith that you happen to subscribe to.
So would you say these prophecies helped to prepare you for the storm that came?
Absolutely. The baptism of fire in 2009 and the inner assurance that, you know, this is not something that I went out of my way looking for in pursuit of an ambition or a selfish interest. This is what God wants me to do. That is why, in the course of the interview, which, as you know, was live, when I was asked, well, we heard from one of your colleagues that you say the Lord wants you to be Chief Justice, which people continue to make mockery of to date. I had no hesitation in saying, as a matter of fact, it is so. Additionally, if you look at my response to the allegations that were leveled against me, my written response, I quote from the Bible because I was sure that I was doing or pursuing the will of God. And that is why, notwithstanding the intensity of the opposition, not just from the country, but from all over the world, the prophecy of God, who never lies, prevailed.
Amen. And we were shocked by some of the common comments in the newspaper. Some people that call themselves constitutional experts, even went as far as saying that Christians should not hold the job of Chief Justice. And a couple of other commentators then responded to that and said, well, when Chief Justice Muhammad was appointed to the bench, there was no outcry, even though he was a Muslim. When there was a Jewish man appointed to the bench, there was no outcry. Are we saying in South Africa that if you're a Christian and hold Christian views, that you are exempted from any high office in South Africa?
Well, that seemed to be the impression sought to be created by some of the commentators. But from where I sit, appreciating the critical importance that our Constitution has to play in ordering the affairs of the South African nation, I think anybody, even those who do not believe in anything, as long as they have what it takes to serve the nation well, as opposed to serving or furthering their own interest, ought to be afforded the opportunity to serve, even at the level of Chief Justice or President. That's in the nature of our constitutional order. And we cannot have a situation where our Constitution provides for the recognition or entrenches the people's constitutional right to believe in whatever they choose to believe in, and yet single out some other faiths for exclusion. It cannot be.
You spoke about yourself and your personal faith in God and how that helped you get through the storm. Did that help your family as well? How did your wife and your kids, with the allegations made against you, some of which was quite nasty, how did they weather that storm?
My wife joined me in the fast. She's a very prayerful woman, by the way. And my children were also occasionally fasting and praying. We all realized that the challenge was beyond any man. There was not a single man, not the president, not a collective of presidents who could handle this situation. The only person who could help me through the nomination process and the interview and capacitate me to respond appropriately to the questions that were posed to me was God. So people knew, and incidentally, they were there when the prophecies were made, and they knew that this was the will of God. So it all made things very easy for us because we knew that it was God and His Word that we had to count on to see us through.
Mr. Chief Justice, we're going to go for a break. When we come back, we're going to talk to you a little bit about, now that you've settled in as Chief Justice of South Africa, how you're enjoying your job. We'll be back shortly. Chief Justice, since your appointment in 2011, you've now been serving on the Constitutional Court for more than a year. How have you settled in and how are you enjoying your new position?
Well, one of the priorities that I set myself in that capacity, openly during my interview and even afterwards, make sure that the South African Judicial Education Institute, whose primary responsibility is to empower judicial officers through training, becomes operational. Those who were closer to the developments would recall that at the time, that institution had been in existence for just over 2.5 years. It had a budget every year of some 22 million rands, and yet not a single training program was undertaken by that institution. I'm not blaming anybody, I'm just identifying a need that cried out for urgent attention. So as soon as I took office, I convened a meeting of the council that is responsible for the administration of that institute and said, it's about time that the institution runs. To cut the long story short, our first meeting was on the 10th of November 2011, and by the 16th of January 2012, we had programs running to train judges who since appointment had not been trained, to train regional court magistrates who since appointment had not been trained, and similarly to offer training to district court magistrates who had not had the benefit of the training that they required desperately to inject the capacity without which they would not be able to perform as well as our constitutional mandate requires of them to undertake. And throughout 2012 to date, we have, and I say it with all sense of humility, outdone ourselves in terms of capacity building and training judicial officers.
So it appears you hit the ground running.
Well, that's the undertaking that I made during my acceptance speech when, on the 8th of September, when the President announced my appointment. I said, what we're going to do is to hit the ground running. That's what we did. But also to make sure that the newly established national department, which is known as the Office of the Chief Justice, is fully staffed, identifies the responsibilities that it could immediately undertake, and support the judiciary as much as it could. So we went about advertising the post of Secretary General, and that is the Director General of the department. We just chose to be a bit different. And that other senior officials in that department are also appointed, that the private office of the Chief Justice was up and running, and we've got that done. I just had a meeting with the minister a few minutes ago, and he confirmed that yesterday Cabinet appointed the Secretary General of the department, a permanent Secretary General of the department. We've been operating on with an acting Secretary General. We've had, for the first time in the history of the judiciary, a judicial retreat during the first 2 weeks of August last year, which was, the leadership of the judiciary at the higher courts level, your judges, president, the Chief Justice, deputies, and president of the Supreme Court of Appeal, doing a very brutal introspection of themselves and of the justice system, saying the public has been complaining about the underperformance of the court system, which borders on dysfunctionality. Let us be honest with ourselves and say, what is it that we have not been doing right? What solutions can we bring about, so that the system begins to function better? And thereafter, we also had the leadership of the regional courts, in other words, the regional court presidents. They had a similar meeting, and the chief magistrates followed, same facilitators from jurisdictions that have made a lot of progress in terms of ensuring that their judiciaries function better and in a way that can only, leave the broader public with no choice but to congratulate them on a job well done. We have also, on the 13th of October last year, identified the need to establish a structure which we ultimately decided to call the National Efficiency Enhancement Committee. This structure is chaired by the Chief Justice, and its members comprises the National Commissioner of the South African Police Service, the Director General for Justice, the Director General for Public Works. They provide us with the infrastructure. The Director General of Social Development, they help us with social workers and probation officers. We're on the verge of bringing on board the National Commissioner of Correctional Services. I have a meeting with him tomorrow. And the Director General for Health. We have the leadership of the attorneys profession, the leadership of the advocates profession, the National Prosecuting Authority, Legal Aid South Africa. We have all the key role players in the justice system, and the objective sought to be achieved is to identify all the challenges that each stakeholder creates for the other, the problems that each stakeholder creates for the other, which inadvertently impedes the progress that other stakeholder otherwise could have made. In other words, where are the bottlenecks? Who's responsible for these problems? And together as the broader justice family, we identify the solution to these problems. And I'm humbled to inform you that we have made humbling progress indeed. We've got the terms of reference settled. We've got a National Operations Committee working on the specific areas that we have identified, like, how are we going to monitor performance? How are we going to evaluate performance? Which infrastructure do we need? And how are we going to manage, court cases? How are we going to deal with the backlog? So as the name of the committee suggests, it's all about efficiency and effectiveness. So the idea was to set up this structure comprising the judiciary and those who come from the executive side of government at a national level. Once we have identified what needs to be done and how, we will then cascade this structure down to the provinces, to the regions, and to the districts to ensure that at every level, all the key court process participants have a platform at which they can talk about their problems rather than talking about them in the public domain, identify solutions, monitor progress, and that's how we're going to be going forward, just to make sure that we at least reduce significantly the complaints that we read about in the newspapers, that we listen to in the broadcast media almost on a daily basis.
Which brings me to my next question, because it does appear that in a relatively short time, you have made extraordinary progress since your appointment. The next question then is, South Africa is facing a number of challenges, and we want to know from you, in your opinion, what is the judiciary or the constitutional court's role in strengthening our democracy? Because there's been a number of comments that our judiciary is weakening, our democratic principles are weakening as a result of that. And so when we come back from the break, we want to ask you that question and get your response. Chief Justice, we were talking about South Africa, the challenges we face as a nation, and the role of the judiciary in strengthening democracy. So in your opinion, what do you believe the role of the judiciary is in strengthening our democratic institutions and principles in South Africa?
Well, you would recall that the judiciary, one, is the third arm of the state, the third arm of government. So you really can't talk about government if the judiciary is not included in your conception of what government is about. But more importantly, the judiciary is the upper guardian of our constitution. So our constitutional democracy, in my view, cannot survive except the judiciary is equal to its constitutional mandate, is equal to the task that it has been assigned. So we see the judiciary as the one arm of the state that has a very critical role to play in sustaining our democracy and even in ensuring that job opportunities are created and sustained, in ensuring that there is economic growth. You may wonder, but how? It is only when you have a judiciary that functions very well, competent judicial officers who dispose of cases expeditiously without compromising the quality of the justice they dispense of, competent judicial officers who render quality judgments, well-trained judicial officers who don't take bribes and are therefore well looked after in terms of salaries and the overall package, that investors would be interested in investing in our country. It is the capacity of the judiciary to even contribute enormously or immensely to the stability, social and political stability in the country, that would give potential investors reason to want to come to that particular country. What investors are interested in, even when you look at the United Nations report on the economy, is a country where once they have invested their resources in the economy of that country, when a dispute arises, they can count on the fact that whatever dispute they may have, either with government or their partners in business, would be adjudicated fairly, would be dealt with impartially. You don't have in place the judiciary that can be dictated to by anybody, however powerful. And it is for this reason that when I talk about the appointment of the judiciary and the kind of judiciary that South Africa needs, I say the judiciary must be independent of the executive and the legislative arm of government. And I say, but that is not enough, because it is not only the politicians in government who have the capacity to intimidate judicial officers into doing what they should not be doing. Powerful opposition parties also have the capacity to do that for as long as they are well connected and well resourced. Big business with all the resources at their command, with access to the media and others, in fact, controlling the media, also have the possibility to influence the judiciary with a view to having them decide the way they, big business, want them to decide. The media as well has the capacity to subject you to so much pressure as a judicial officer that you would find it difficult to render a decision that does not accord with the view, the dominant view in the public domain. And it is therefore important that you create a judiciary that is alive to its constitutional oath, men and women of integrity, men and women of solid character, so that once it gets known, notwithstanding the negative reports here and there that may be unfounded or founded, but the predominant picture of the judiciary that we ought to create is that of a judiciary that is truly impartial, that takes its oath of office very seriously, oath of office or affirmation seriously. And once you have created that environment, there can be a dictatorship, because dictators are only able to overthrow governments and take over when they know that there is a judiciary that is shaky.
Now, this brings me to a question that happened again when you were nominated by President Jacob Zuma. Those were some of the accusations made that the court is going to lose its independence, that you are going to be used, you're a friend of Jacob Zuma, and you're going to toe the political line. We've just heard your view on that. Do you think there's any fear of the judiciary in South Africa ever losing its independence?
No. If there is any such fear, it's unfounded. Speaking for myself, all that people need to do is look at my judgments ever since I took office as Chief Justice. The latest, I think, being Ambrosini, an application brought by a member of the opposition party to say, contrary to the view held by the ruling party, they would want, in the exercise of their constitutional right, to be able to introduce private members' bill. I wrote the judgment, and you can't trace anything that would give you reason to say that this is a person who is beholden to the president and anybody. And incidentally, I know President Zuma, but we're not friends. Not that it's a wrong thing to be his friend, but just for the record, he's not my friend. But the bottom line is, fortunately for the South African judiciary, we are fairly well remunerated. We are fairly well looked after. And our term of office is so secure. And even the protection that we enjoy from being dismissed or impeached from office is so solid that there really is very little opportunity, if any, for a judicial officer to want to corrupt himself or herself by stooping so low as to be dictated to by anybody, however powerful.
Chief Justice, thank you for that thought. We want to talk to you about your vision for the judiciary for the next 5-10 years and how you hope to achieve that. But we'll do that when we come back from the break. In the newspapers, people are saying that perhaps we need specialized courts that would focus on prosecuting and convicting perpetrators of violence against women and children. Do you think that would help bring up the conviction rate and prosecution rate? Because currently, according to the stats we read in the newspapers, of the 64,000 rapes of women in South Africa, about 10% of that is successfully prosecuted. Do you think specialized courts would help us?
I was privileged to chair a committee that was charged with the responsibility to organize the Access to Justice Conference in 2011 under the leadership of my predecessor, Chief Justice Sandile Ngcobo. And one of the issues that featured prominently in our discussions at that conference was the need to establish as many sexual offences courts as possible in South Africa. Following on that, shortly after my appointment, I had a meeting with the former ambassador of the United States in South Africa, Donald Gibbs, and we discussed this issue. And I'm pleased to just mention in passing that subsequent to that, Secretary Hillary Clinton came to the country with an offer of some 600,000 American dollars to add to whatever budget would eventually be set aside to establish the sexual offences courts. You need these specialized courts, one, so that the victims of sexual offences can receive the specialized treatment that they require from the prosecutorial authority officials involved. There is a particular way in which you must prepare them. You need to have properly trained social workers, and it's one of the issues that we are discussing at the NEEC meeting. And this very issue of the establishment of sexual offences court arose again at the meeting we had today of the National Efficiency Enhancement Committee. And I know, as you would have seen in the media, that the position has been taken that more sexual offences courts would be established. But the other critical reason for having to establish as many sexual offences courts as possible is to speed up the processing of these cases. Rape by its very nature is very traumatic. So you don't want to keep the victims long before the matter is heard, because their ability to remember these traumatic experiences and sometimes even the willingness to continue with the case, gets reduced, with the result that you come up with some acquittals in circumstances where a conviction ought to have followed. So they will go a long way towards improving the proper disposition of these cases.
Thank you for that, Chief Justice. My next question, your vision for the judiciary in South Africa for the next 5-10 years, and how you plan to achieve that?
Fundamental to our vision is capacity building. It's important that every court process participant is properly trained, from the interpreters, the prosecutors, the legal practitioners, even the public defenders under the auspices of Legal Aid South Africa, as well as, and more importantly, judicial officers. I've just been empowered by Parliament by amending the Constitution, Section 165, subsection 6, to not only to confirm my role as head of the South African judiciary, but also to establish norms and standards that would speak to performance by all the courts, from the Constitutional Court all the way down to the district courts. So the focus is on establishing those norms. We started with the process long before the amendment became an act, or became part and parcel of the Constitution. And we're on the verge of finalizing those norms and standards that would apply across the board to enhance performance, but more importantly also to bring in place mechanisms for monitoring performance, for evaluating performance, so that nobody hides behind others within the broader justice system. So it's not confined just to the court, to the judiciary, but to the broader justice system. Also important is making sure that at long last the South African judiciary operates very much like your US judiciary, very much like the judiciary of the Russian federations, who have a fully fledged court administration of their own. We've got to have our own budget vote. We've got to have court services which now resort under the Minister for Justice and Constitutional Development transferred to the Office of the Chief Justice as a national department. But we also have to migrate from the status of being a national department to becoming some legislatively created entity that is responsible for the running of the affairs of the judiciary. We've got to get to the point where we have our own buildings, because in our view, a lot of money gets wasted through the process of renting buildings. They prove to be too costly than it would be the case if you had your own building. It's not unheard of that a person, uses the money for rental to buy a building and later make more money as a result of this lease of buildings.
Is this court buildings and office buildings for judicial officers?
For judicial officers, and for all institutions that are critical to the functioning of the courts. More importantly, the vision is to get the South African judiciary and broader court system to a state where efficiency and effectiveness is yet another name by which the South African judiciary is known. This is important because we are involved at a SADC and East Africa level. There is a forum of chief justices there. I attended that meeting for the first time during the course of July last year. I was privileged to be appointed to chair a committee that would look into the strategic plan and action plan of the forum that spreads across the two regions. I drafted something which I've passed it on to them, and it will be up to the AGM of the forum to decide what is going to make of the proposal. We also have a continental structure which I believe the good work that we do as the South African judiciary could inform what the judiciary does at the regional level, but also inform what the judiciary does at a continental level. I ran into the new commissioner of the chair, I beg your pardon, the chair of the AU Commission, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the other day, and I said to her, it's important that we establish a link between the judiciary and any forum of presidents and ministers at the regional level, but also any forum that exists at a continental level, and in this case, it is the AU, the commission of which you are chair. So you see, for instance, there have been developments around the SADC tribunal, which is more or less some regional equivalent of whatever the European Commission might have at a regional level. There is a court that was put in place at a continental level, the African People and Human Rights Court. The judiciary was not involved in any meaningful way in the establishment of these structures. We need to create a platform for an exchange of views between the judiciary, the executive, and possibly even the legislative arm of governments at the regional level, but also at AU level, so that the situation that now obtains of the politicians taking the decisions that affects the judiciaries in the continent without engaging the judiciary meaningfully is something of the past. And she and I agreed that she will communicate, some information to me on the basis of which I could then ask the chairs of the SADC forum and the president of the continental structure to put on the agendas of these fora this item in our meetings, so that we can take a position. We can come up with a vision that is not only confined to a particular country, but applies to each region, but more importantly also applies to the continent.
Chief Justice, it does appear that you have a broad vision, a confident vision to entrench the principles of our democracy, also the judiciary in South Africa, and we are honored and privileged to be able to speak to you on Watchmen on the Wall today and to hear your vision for South Africa. Despite the troubles of the past, you have come through, you've hit the ground running, and we believe that you are going to do everything you said you're going to do. We want to thank you once again for joining us on this program to come and speak to us, and we wish you the very best in your future.
Thank you very much.
God bless you.
Thank you. God bless you too. I'm very grateful for the invite.
Thank you.